Hey everyone, today we're going to talk about the subjunctive mood in Latin. Now, there's a lot here because the subjunctive is really used quite a bit in Latin, and we'll see why in a second. But the main thing I want to do today is talk about the subjunctive in three different ways. I want to talk about what the subjunctive is, number one. Two, I want to talk about how you form the subjunctive. What's the morphology? What does it look like? And then three, how do you translate the subjunctive? That's always the big question that I'm asked is how do you translate the subjunctive? It's not as straightforward as, let's say, the indicative mood. Once again, when we talk about why it is the way that it is, we'll see the reason for that. So we'll go ahead then and get started with what is the subjunctive? What is the subjunctive? Well, for starters, the subjunctive is a Latin mood. What does that mean? Well, mood comes from the Latin word modus. And this means way or manner. And so a mood is a way or a manner of expressing verbal action. And we've got three moods that we talk about. We've talked about the indicative quite a bit already. We've done a lot with the indicative mood. And the indicative, that comes from the Latin indicare. And that just means to point out. Right? So the indicative mood is something that happens in real life. Then there's the imperative. The imperative mood. And the imperative mood, that comes from the Latin word imperare. And that just means to command. And so as we've dealt with the imperative just means to give a command. Which brings us to what we're going to talk about today, the subjunctive. And the subjunctive comes from the Latin subjungere, which means to subjoin. That's a very literal translation, or to subordinate. And there's the visual that we'll see is that we'll use today is something like this, where when you've got something like a main clause, then the subjunctive is going to be subjoined to that or subordinate to that. And we'll let that play itself out here pretty soon. Something to keep in mind, since this is a really important mood in Latin, because in Latin we like to say, when in doubt, subordinate. This is something that is very common for Latin. They love subordinate clauses. Love subordinate clauses. So that means that Latin also likes to use the subjunctive mood. All right, so further then, what does that mean for the subjunctive? Well, that means that the subjunctive mood is a mood of potential. It's a hypothetical action. It's a contingent, as we could see from the image above, a contingent action. Shows contingency. The reality of the subjunctive mood is uncertain and unknown, just by its nature. It's an offshoot of reality. It's an offshoot of the indicative, really. So it only exists in the present and the past tenses. It doesn't exist in the future because that would be redundant or potentially contrary to the future reality, to the future indicative. So here's a visual that might be helpful. Here's a timeline, and we'll put the present tense here, and the future here, and the past here. And we'll say that the top part of this timeline, that's the indicative. And the bottom part we'll call the subjunctive. Okay, now, what you're going to be able to do with the subjunctive is we're going to be able to show contingent or hypothetical or potential contemporaneous action in the past, in the present, and also in the future. We're also going to be able to show subsequent action in the past, to the present, or to the future. We're also going to be able to show this hypothetical prior action from the past, the present, in the future. And the way that Latin does this with the subjunctive and the tenses is really important. We're going to talk about this later on. We talk about how do you translate the subjunctive. But this makes translation much more complicated because the subjunctive, being contingent by nature, is reliant then on its context. It's reliant on its relationship to the main clause most of the time. It just depends on how it's being used in its respective clause, which is why it's so difficult to give a straightforward answer when people ask, well, how do you translate this? Okay, how do you translate this? So again, we'll go into more detail when we get to the translation section in a few minutes. For now, we want to move ahead and we'll talk about morphology. Now that we have a better understanding of what the subjunctive is, and this will all become clearer when we talk about translation, we want to talk about, well, how do you create a subjunctive verb? How do you conjugate, build one up? And so that's what we'll go ahead and do now. Okay, now that we've talked a little bit about what the subjunctive is, and hopefully that will be clearer and clearer as we move on here, we need to talk about how do you form the subjunctive. Now, there aren't as many tenses in the subjunctive mood as we have in the indicative, and again, that's because there's kind of this weird relationship that the subjunctive has with the future, but we do see the subjunctive in the present tense, the imperfect tense, the perfect, and the pluperfect. So we'll go ahead and break those down and talk about how do you form these. It might be simpler than you would expect, I would hope at least. So let's go ahead and dig into those. The first thing to recognize is that thinking about the different verbal system or the tense systems in Latin, this will be really helpful here and then later on as we go. So remember that there are two tense systems. There's the present system and there's the perfect system. And we've talked about the differences between these two. The tenses that are important for us, because we're not doing any futures, in the present system, the present tense, in the imperfect tense. And then for the perfect system, the perfect and the pluperfect. Again, the future is absent here. And again, knowing that the present tense and the imperfect tense are both a part of the present system is really important for this, as well as knowing that the perfect tense and the pluperfect tense are part of the perfect system. That's really important, not only for how morphology, how you put the verbs together, but also when it comes to translation in the next section after this. So let's go ahead and dig in then to the present subjunctive. And this is going to be active and passive. It's again, this is going to be the most complicated form of the subjunctive here, strangely enough. Usually you wouldn't expect that with the present tense, but it is. So, the present subjunctive, and we're going to do here active and passive. Active and passive. Now, what's important here is that the way to recognize it, how do you recognize it? It's all in the linking vowel. Remember, linking vowels are important. Linking vowels can be the difference between a present and a future tense, depending on what conjugation you're dealing with. And something that's really important to think about with, especially with these linking vowels, is there's a little device to help remember it, and you'll see this in a second. I'll write this all out in a second here. But if you can remember, we fear a liar, then you can do the present subjunctive in both the active and the passive. Okay, so I'll compare then the linking vowels. These are the linking vowels. All right, it's all in we fear a liar. So the indicative linking vowels, which you know, for the first conjugation, the second conjugation, the third O, I'm going to split up the third O and the third IO, third conjugation, and the fourth, you know these linking vowels as, well, the long A in the first, the long E in the second. The third, in both the third O and the third IO, have the short I, and then the fourth has the long I. Okay. The subjunctive then is we fear a liar, but it gets a little confusing when we get to the third and fourth conjugations. There's the long E replaces the long A in the first conjugation. And the second conjugation, the E is shortened and a long A is added to it. And the third conjugation, that short I is completely replaced with a long A. And then whereas in the indicative, the third O and the third IO shared that short I, in the subjunctive, the third IO is actually more like the fourth. And they both have a short I and a long A. Okay, again, we fear a liar. You can see E-A-A-I-A. So you'll also notice that though the A is switched out for the long E from the indicative to the subjunctive in the first conjugation, you'll notice that in the second, in the third IO in the fourth as well, that an A is actually added to the equation here. And this long A is actually, it's a tell for the present subjunctive. In fact, the only place we lose it is where in the first conjugation where we had an A in the first place. But for the other ones, it's a sign that you might be dealing with a present subjunctive. So that's the linking vowel. That's the key to this whole thing for the present subjunctive. So how do you form it then? Well, it's pretty easy. All you do is you take the second principal part, stem, you add your subjunctive linking vowel, subjunctive linking vowel, and then you add whatever active or passive ending you need. This is just your present endings, your normal endings that you deal with all the time. And there you go. You've got your present subjunctive, active or passive. So let's do a couple of examples here. We'll do a second conjugation verb, then we'll do a third IO. Okay, so let's take moneo. Okay, and we'll do it in the second person plural. Okay, so for the present indicative and the present subjunctive, and we'll put them both just to compare them, and we'll do it active and passive, just so you kind of get the full picture here. Okay. We'll take that second principal part, stem, and just like with the, in the indicative, you take the same stem and you get your normal linking vowel and your ending, monetis. For the passive, it's going to be mon-a mini. Okay, we've done this. For the subjunctive, then, you take that same stem, and now for your linking vowel, you've got this E, long A, but the same endings. And again, in the passive, same stem, new linking vowel, but the same endings. And there you have it. So the linking vowel matters. The linking vowel really, really matters here. Okay. Let's do a third IO verb. So we'll leave that up for comparison here. And so this is a third IO. And we'll do capio. And let's do it in the first person plural. And so we've got our present indicative for comparison to our present subjunctive. And again, we'll do active and passive. So we end up with capimus, right? That short I and the linking vowel with mus as our ending. Capimer, passive ending. And then for the subjunctive, all that changes is the linking vowel. From capimus to capiamus. That long A. And from capimur to capiamur. So again, the linking vowel matters. The linking vowel really, really matters here. And that's the present subjunctive. That's all it is. Different linking vowel for each conjugation. Again, we fear a liar. If you can do that, then you can do the present subjunctive. For the imperfect, the perfect, and the pluperfect, it's even less complex because all the conjugations are done exactly the same. So this is really the most complicated thing that we're doing here with the subjunctive as far as morphology goes. Now, again, translation, it's going to be a little more complicated, but we'll get to that when we get to that. So let's go ahead and move on then to the imperfect subjunctive, and we'll do the active and the passive. Now, this is a little odd, this form. It's not difficult, it's just odd. And the reason is because you use a second principal part like you'd expect, but instead of just using the second principal part, you actually use the full infinitive, not just the stem. You use the full infinitive here. And this is that present active infinitive Exclamation mark. So the full infinitive, and what you do is you take that infinitive and you just add your active and passive ending to it. Or I should say active or passive ending. And that's your form. And that's how it is for all four conjugations. So again, let's go ahead and do an example. I should say that the e at the end, there is some change. The e at the end of the infinitive that links then to the active or passive ending, that actually is lengthened before the ending. The only time where you actually see it short is if it's followed by an m, an r, or a t, or a final or medial nt. Okay, so but for the most part, it remains long. So let's go ahead and do moneo again. We're going to do moneo throughout the entire thing just to be consistent. All right, so we'll also do it, all the examples here, we'll do in the second person plural, partially just because it tends to be, I don't know, it's kind of an odd form. I don't know why. But, okay, so we'll do the imperfect indicative and the imperfect subjunctive just for comparison. And we'll do them again, active and passive. So you can get as much of the picture as possible here. All right, so the active forms, we've done these. Again, Monet, then we get that ba infix, and then our ending, right? That's typical imperfect indicative. Passive, same thing. Ba infix, and then we've got our ending here. Monet ba mini. All right. This is going to look radically different than, whereas previously for the present subjunctive, it was just a matter of a linking vowel. This is going to look radically different. So there is no ba infix, none of that. It's just the infinitive with the ending. So Monet re tis. Monet re mini. And that's it. You take that infinitive, that present active infinitive, and you just put an ending on the end of it. It's that simple, although it looks a little strange. So you should, you'll see these a lot, and you'll see the infinitive with an ending, and you think, okay, that's an imperfect subjunctive. It's kind of strange, but it's an imperfect subjunctive. All right, we'll go ahead and move on from that second principal part now. And we will move on to the perfect and the pluperfect subjunctive active. Now, remember that the perfect system utilizes the third and fourth principal parts. Third for the active and fourth for the passive. We're going to do the perfect and pluperfect subjunctive active, and then we'll do the perfect and pluperfect subjunctive passive together, right? Because the former take the third principal part, and the latter take the fourth principal part. So the perfect subjunctive active. Now, notice again that I've not translated any of these forms, okay? And there's a reason for that. So just kind of hold on to that question again. I know it's always asked of me. There's a reason. You'll see in the next section here why that is. All right. So the perfect subjunctive active. It's not that complicated. Although it can be tricky. It's potentially hazardous here. You'll see in a second here. All you do is you take the third principal part, just like you'd expect. And again, it's the stem, not like that the imperfect or something. It's just the stem, and you add to it E, R, I. And that I there, it shortens before M, T, and NT. So it's usually long, but not always. And then you add your active endings. Okay, now you have to be careful with this one. That ERI should be, there should be red flags here. Because what you need to know about this is that these forms, they're going to remind you a lot of the future perfect. And they will be very easily confused with the future perfect. And this makes a lot of sense that the perfect subjunctive looks like the future perfect, again, because it's kind of like this weird, it's got this weird relationship with the future tense. That's kind of strange, but you just be careful with this. Be aware of this. So we'll do moneo. And we'll do it in the second person plural again. And we'll do, for comparison, a perfect indicative. And then the perfect subjunctive. This is kind of a strange comparison here because remember that the perfect indicative is kind of off. It's a little bit different. It's got those weird endings. We're only doing active here. Okay, so you take that for the perfect indicative. You take that third principal part. It's manu here. Manui is going to be the principal part. You drop that ending and then you add your istis. There's perfect endings. Right, there's perfect active endings. For the subjunctive, you just use the normal endings, the regular present endings that you use for most everything else. You take that principal part, that third principal part, drop the ending, and you add eritis. Okay, pretty straightforward there. Pretty straightforward. Now, the pluperfect subjunctive active is just as simple. It looks, it takes the same principal, that same principal part, that third principal part stem. Although it's a little strange. It also has an infix, but the infix is nothing like this ERI infix for the pluperfect subjunctive. And I'll put it right underneath so you can see the comparison here. You take that third principal part stem, and instead of adding like ERI as an infix, you add I, S, S, E. And that E is going to shorten before an M. And then you add your active endings. Okay, so it's just as simple, but you have to remember the infix. As long as you remember the infix of the ERI for the perfect subjunctive active, and for the pluperfect subjunctive active, the ISSE, then you're good. That's all it is, just an infix. So let's do moneo again. Second person plural. Indicative and subjunctive for comparison, and of course only in the active voice. Okay. So remember, for the for that pluperfect indicative, you're taking the third principal part and then you are putting an imperfect to be verb on it, right? So it's plusquam perfectum. It's more than perfect, right? So for this, you have your infix, and instead of it being like a to be verb or something, you've got your isse. So you do the same thing, same principal part. but in this case, ISSE, and then your ending. So again, third principal part, stem, isse is your infix, and then your active endings, and you've got your pluperfect subjunctive active. It's that simple. It's that simple. We'll go ahead then and move on to the perfect and pluperfect subjunctive passive. And these are even more what you'd expect. It's funny because, when you're dealing with perfect and pluperfect passive, even in the indicative, it seems to be one of the more complicated things that you do. But when you come into the subjunctive, it's actually something that's very normal and very predictable. You could very well guess how to form these, I think. So, of course, we'll be using the fourth principal part. And these forms are just going to look a lot like the indicative with one little change. And I'll show you what that is. So, perfect subjunctive passive. All you do is you take that fourth principal part, and remember, you're not taking the stem because that fourth principal part is the perfect passive participle. So you let that stand alone as its own word, like you would in the indicative, and you put with it, it's used with the present subjunctive form of sum. So the only difference here is that for the perfect subjunctive passive, you're using the subjunctive form of sum rather than the indicative form of sum. That's it. And so we'll go ahead and write those out then. Sum in the singular and plural. First, second, third person. Sim. Sis, sit, and the plural, simus, sitis, sent. So you take the fourth principal part, and then you just use this in connection with it. Again, two separate words, but used together. And so we'll do moneo again. And we'll do the second person plural again, just because to be consistent. And we'll do the perfect indicative along with the perfect subjunctive. And this time, again, we're doing passive now rather than active. So, remember, since we're doing second plural, we want to use that fourth principal part, that perfect passive participle, but we need it to be pluralized. We need that plural ending. Okay, and we'll just do a masculine plural here. So moneti, and then it would be now. So we know we're talking about more than one individual, but now we need it to be you all, right? So second person, so estis. And so the only difference here then is we change that to be verb. I mean, you can really see how the participle truly is a verbal adjective. It's allowing this to be verb to do even the mood work of the verb. That's where we get the mood from, is in this to be verb. So we get all kinds of, we get some meaning and number from the participle itself. We get the person, and reflected also in the number and the mood in the to be verb. So moneti estis is then goes to moneti sitis. Sitis. All right. So that's it. That's how you form it. The pluperfect subjunctive is very similar to that. All you do is you take it back a step. So you do it exactly the same way, except you use instead of using the present subjunctive form of sum, you're now dealing with the imperfect subjunctive of sum. And remember, the the imperfect subjunctive you form with the infinitive and then an ending. So we're going to see the exact same thing here with the to be verb. Okay, so you take your fourth principal part, again, with the imperfect subjunctive assume, and we'll write those out again like last time. So singular, plural, 1, 2, and 3. And since the infinitive is essay, right, that's reflected here. SM, essemus. And again, you can even the E is long where it's supposed to be long. Essays, essatis, asset, assent. Okay, so now all we have to do is put this with the fourth principal part. So we'll do moneo again. Second person plural. Do our comparison. And again, passive. And you made the same move, right, in the indicative as you do in the subjunctive. So from the present to be verb, even in the indicative, you go moneti iratis, right? You were, right? So we have moneti, and now we have essatis. So the exact same move that you make in the indicative, you make that in the subjunctive. And that's all it is. That's how you form the subjunctive in the present, in the imperfect, and then also in the perfect, in the pluperfect for the perfect system. Again, I can't tell you how to translate each of those because we're about to see in a second that the translation depends on how it's being used. So we'll go ahead and move to this final segment. I know this is a lot, but this final segment of how do you use the subjunctive and therefore how do you translate it? To answer this question, one of the most important and most foundational things you can do is go back to those the distinction between the present system and the perfect system and how they interact in a subjunctive clause with the main clause. And this is something called the sequence of tenses. The sequence of tenses. How does the main clause relate to the subjunctive clause? Because remember that subjunctive clause is usually a dependent clause or a subordinate clause. It is based on something else. It's contingent on something else. That's what it means to be subjunctive in the first place, as we already talked about. There are kind of two categories of, or I should say, two ways to categorize tenses in order to kind of sift through this. And here they are. This is what's, again, called the sequence of tenses. You've got what we've talked about before is the present system, and the perfect system, and that's one important distinction. The other important distinction is between what we call primary tenses and secondary tenses. And when you understand the relationship between the primary tenses and the secondary tenses that they have between the present system and the perfect system, then you can translate the subjunctive with relative ease. So what does this mean? Well, the primary tenses are the tenses that are present or future. And so that's pretty easy to list, right? The present tense, the future tense, the future perfect. See, this is not the same as the present system and the perfect system. This is a different way to categorize them. And then, surprisingly, the perfect. Now, the perfect is going to fall under, it can be a primary tense or a secondary tense. It can be a primary tense if we're talking about it as a completed action now in the present. Okay, it kind of fulfills that present tense that it needs to be at least present or future for a primary tense. The secondary tenses then are going to be your past tenses. And that's going to be your imperfect, your perfect, and your pluperfect. Okay, now, if you have a verb, an indicative verb, and the main clause, that's a primary tense, so we'll say main clause here. That's a primary tense verb. Oops. And you want to show that the subordinate clause is happening at the same time or later on, then you have to use a present subjunctive. If you want to show that the subordinate clause is happening at the same time or later than the main clause, and you're dealing with a primary tense verb in the main clause, you have to use a present subjunctive. So that would be for contemporaneous or subsequent action. If you have a secondary tense in the main clause, one of those past tenses down below there, and you want to show contemporaneous action or subsequent action, then your subjunctive verb in your subjunctive clause or your subordinate clause, that has to be an imperfect. Subjunctive. So notice that the subordinate clause showing contemporaneous action, which action is happening at the same time, or subsequent action, that's guided by subjunctive verbs in the present system. The present subjunctive for the present and future tenses, the imperfect subjunctive for the past tenses. If you want to show prior action, again, this is in the subordinate clause here. So this side is the main clause. This side is a subordinate clause. Okay. If you want to show prior action in the subordinate clause, something it happened previously, and you're dealing with a primary tense verb, one from the top of the list there, or the top half of the list, then you have to use a perfect subjunctive. And if you are dealing with a secondary tense in the main clause and want to show prior action, then you have to use a pluperfect subjunctive. And this is a sequence of tenses. This is how it works. Okay? You see how it's all contingent, right? This is why it's so difficult to say, how do you translate this? It's not that simple. At the same time, it's simple in a different way, okay? The better you get to know that chart, the better off you'll be. And I know it's kind of a lot to take in all at once, but when you see the flow of it and you actually have it memorized, then it comes pretty quickly when you're actually translating, and it settles and it becomes simpler than it might seem. Okay, but you can see again, main clause has a primary tense. Okay, if you want the subordinate clause to be happening at the same time, you use the present subjunctive. If you want it to be prior time, then you have to use the perfect subjunctive. Again, remember that's what the present system does and the perfect system does. Remember, the present system is kind of this ongoing action. It's action happening kind of in the now, even if it is imperfect present or future. It's still happening as it's like as the sentence is being read, it's happening. Whereas in the perfect system, it's already happened. It's already in a state of having happened. Okay? And so if you want to talk about prior action, the perfect is prior to the present. And the pluperfect is prior to the past. Okay? Again, you don't need a future tense. Contemporaneous action is in the present or the imperfect subjunctive. Also subsequent action. So that can show some kind of a future sense. Okay? It can have kind of a future sense to it. All right. So I'm going to do one more kind of illustration, and then we'll talk about the individual clauses themselves, and then we'll be done. All right. So to illustrate this in a different way, I'm gonna do that same timeline that I did before at the beginning of the video, except we're gonna have some nuances here now. All right, so present, future, past. All right, notice I'm not distinguishing between different past tenses. I'm just saying past. It's all that needs to happen at the moment. And this top is indicative. So this is going to be the main clause. And the bottom side is going to be the subjunctive. Okay. And if I want, and so that means that these are going to be the secondary tenses in the past. In the future and in the present, these are going to be the primary tenses. Okay. So, if I want to show contemporaneous action for each of these happening at the same time, and remember, kind of in this contingent way, or this hypothetical way, because it's not even necessarily real, it's breaking from reality. Then for my past tenses, I have to use the imperfect subjunctive. For my present and future, I have to use the present subjunctive. And that's for contemporaneous action. That's also for subsequent action. So it can be happening at the same time or will be happening. If I want to do prior action for the secondary tenses, Again, I have to use the pluperfect subjunctive. And for the present tense, I have to use the perfect subjunctive. And the same goes for the future. So that's how it looks then. Okay. This is kind of the theory. This is the theory that's you know has no context to it. So what happens when you add some context to it? What happens when you actually have to use this and actually have to translate it? Well, that's where we get our different kinds of clauses. And there's a lot of different kinds of clauses in Latin. Latin loves to operate with clauses. It's a very important unit. Different languages have different units that they like to operate in. Latin really likes to put a lot of stuff together into a clause, and you take something as a clause and you translate it as a clause. And actually, within that clause, you're going to get, it's going to be greater than the sum of its parts. It's going to have meaning to it depending on how the clause is arranged. And so we get to talk about a few of them here. First one that we'll do. We're going to talk about two that are kind of related to each other and that are, frankly, can be easy to confuse here. So the first is a purpose clause. Okay, and there's a certain way to recognize a clause like this. You're going to recognize this as a subjunctive clause which is introduced by ut. So it's a subjunctive clause that's introduced by ut. If it's being negated, because you can have a clause that's negated, then it's going to be introduced by ne. And then your subjunctive. So if you see ut or ne in the subjunctive, you could be dealing with a purpose clause. Now these are often adverbial clauses. But you might also see a relative purpose clause, and this happens when the ut is actually replaced by a relative pronoun. And you'll know it's a purpose clause rather than just a relative clause because the verb will be subjunctive. And it's just kind of a nuance, a different kind of purpose clause. But you'll translate it relatively the same, okay? And again, so a relative pronoun, you might see a form of, qui, quai, quad or something, and then your subjunctive. All right, so we'll go ahead and do purpose clauses. We're going to do primary sequences and then secondary sequences. And this is the only time I'm going to do this here in this video, do all these verbs together, just so you can see it, all right? So we'll do our primary sequence. And we'll try to keep it as simple as possible, all right? So, Jesu in domum intrat ut Mariam videat. Jesu in domum intrat ut Mariam videat. Okay, that translates to Jesus enters into the house in order to see Mary. Jesus enters into the house in order to see Mary. And so you can see our clause. We've got ut, and then we've got our subjunctive, videat. So you've got our primary clause, Jesu in domum intrat, and that's just a present tense intrat, ut Miriam videat. So, and that videat is going to show it could be in order that he sees Mary, in order that he might see, like again, kind of future sense or subsequent. I could replace it with a perfect in order that he saw Mary, I guess, previous action, prior action. But this, you know, this this videat here at the end, that can go with a slew of indicative verbs here. I mean, you could replace intrat with, let's say, intrabit, right? Jesus will enter the house in order to see Mary. And it's in videat is now contemporaneous action with intrabit or intrawit. And this would be like that completed action in the perfect. Jesus kind of is entered the house in order to see Mary, something like that. We could go future perfect. Okay. Jesus will have entered into the house in order to see Mary. Okay. So that, again, that present subjunctive is contemporaneous action with all of these primary verbs here. Okay, we can do a secondary sequence sentence now. We can change it. Same sentence. Jesu in domum. But this time, we'll change to a secondary sequence of verbs, intrabat, ut Miriam. And because we changed to a secondary sequence verb, now we've got to use that imperfect subjunctive if we want to do contemporaneous action. And so this is Jesus was entering the house in order to see Mary. Notice that there's ut and videret. Notice that videret is translated just like videat, translated exactly the same. Even though that videat is present and videret is imperfect, they both show contemporaneous action with their respective main clause or main verb, primary sequence versus secondary sequence. So this is why it's so difficult to translate the subjunctive or to ask for a translation in a vacuum, because it's so contingent upon something else, right? Kind of by nature. And we can go through these then. We've got intrabat, so we could do intravit, which Jesus entered the house in order to see Mary, or go full pluperfect. Intraverat. Jesus had entered the house in order to see Mary. So in order to is kind of an accepted way to translate this clause. Now, we could go to the other side then and say, okay, so videat and videret, those are showing, contemporaneous action or, possible subsequent action, future action. Well, if we want to do prior action, which is kind of weird for a purpose clause, I'm not really sure it fits, but we'll do it just to kind of fulfill the whole sequence of tenses here, just so we can see the larger picture. Remember that we'll need a perfect if we want to show prior action in the primary sequence, so we'd be dealing with videret. And then we'll need a pluperfect in the secondary sequence, and that would be videsit. So that pretty much sums it up for the purpose clause. We'll move on now. I'm not going to go through all of these, all of these verbs for every single clause, but we'll do examples now of the result clause and talk about the result clause as it's kind of related to the purpose clause. Now, the result clause shows the result of the action in the main clause, as you might have guessed. It kind of answers the question, what is or was the outcome? It tells you what's the consequence of the action. So how do you recognize it then? Well, you recognize it that the main clause is going to begin with an adverb ita, tom, or seek. So you get ita, tom, or seek, and those all kind of just mean so. So you get this is you could begin with this adverb, or you could begin with an adjective. The adjective tantus, and that's like so much. Okay. Now I should say, I don't think I said this before. The main clause begins with these. So you get let's say ita plus your your indicative, and then you have your result clause, which is going to begin with ut, ending in your subjunctive. So the main clause begins with ita, tom, or seek, or tantus, and then your result clause, your subjunctive clause, your subordinate clause, begins with ut. Now, if you want to negate the subjunctive clause, that's the subordinate clause, or the result clause here specifically, you can do that with none. Remember, with the purpose clause, you'd use nay, and it would replace that first signal word. But here you add it to the signal word. So you can negate it by adding it in along with ut, none, or nihil, or nemo. And these are all like, non negates the verb. Nihil is nothing. Nemo is no one, right? There's several words that you can do this with, and they do not replace ut. They do not replace ut. Okay. You can have a relative result clause, which can be formed in the same way that we do with a purpose clause. All right. So that's also possible. So we'll compare these two clauses then, and I'm not going to go through all the sequence of tenses with the result clause because it works the same way as we saw it with the purpose clause, the same exact way. So I'm just going to kind of compare two results, or a result clause and a purpose clause, and these are actually, you can find these in your Wheelock book on 238. I really like these examples. So the result clause. Tom, there's that introductory adverb for the main clause. Tom strinue, laborat, ut, multa, perficiat. And you see that IA linking vowel in perficiat. You see that? There's your kind of your result clause there at the end. He works so strenuously that he accomplishes many things. Now let's compare that to a purpose. So that's result. He does this, so this happens. Not in order for this to happen, but it just happens. It results. Okay, it's the consequence of his action. So we'll take out Tom and just start with strenua, or strenue. Laborat, ut, multa, perficiat. Again, that same, look at this. Same ut, multa, perficiat, same clause. This one just doesn't, the main clause doesn't begin with the Tom. And so this is, he works strenuously so that he might accomplish many things. So the first is, this result is, he works so strenuously that he accomplishes many things. All right, it's just the natural result of what happens when he does this. This purpose is, he works so strenuously so that he may accomplish many things. See the difference here? So you have to watch out for these, these signal words. So, show you that there's greater meaning here than what might meet the eye. Okay, well, really quickly now we'll move on to the last two different uses here, and these are. This, especially this first one, I suppose. I guess they're both common, but indirect questions. More and more we'll get into different, well, I guess just did indirect discourse, or indirect statements, but more and more you'll see indirect. Now, indirect questions, these can be introduced by some kind of a question word or interrogative adjective. And there's a lot of variety here, but it's really just another form of indirect speech. Okay, so basically what an indirect question is, you're saying that someone is asking a question without quoting them directly. That's what this is. You're saying someone is asking a question just without quoting them directly. They say that, or they ask that, right? We do this all the time in English. So we'll start with a direct question and compare. Again, we'll keep it simple. Okay. A direct question, like a quote, would be something like this. Rogant, they're asking, quid Jesu dicit. And so we've got a primary tense verb here in the main clause, just rogant, and then in your subordinate clause, your secondary, your other main clause, I should say, your other clause, your quoting clause, you've also got a primary verb. It's indicative. It's all indicative here, so it's very simple. They are asking, what is Jesus saying? They are asking, what is Jesus saying? And it's quoted. Okay, so you're hearing them with their own words. This is literally what they're asking. An indirect question. Okay, is going to say something like the same thing, but it's not. You are paraphrasing it, or you're saying a different way. You're not quoting them directly. So they are asking. We can do this again. Rogant. Okay, quid Jesu diciat. Notice there's no question mark here. Okay? So they are asking what Jesus is saying. See the difference between the direct question? They are asking, what is Jesus saying? The indirect question is, they are asking what Jesus is saying, or they're asking about what Jesus is saying, something like that. And so you get your primary sequence verb, rogant, and then contemporaneous action with your present subjunctive. Okay. But that's an indirect question. It's just not a direct quote. The last one I want to look at really quickly is the jussive. Okay, this is a jussive use of the subjunctive. This is a standalone use, so this is not as a subordinate clause. Okay. And I believe this is the only, I think the Wheelock book says this is the only place where we actually see it. This is the only one they talk about in that book. So it comes from hubere, like the word jussive. It comes from the verb hubere, which is to order. And in Latin, it's a command. That's in the first and third person. For the second person, they have different ways of doing commands. Okay, not this. All right, and it can be singular or plural. Okay, and you would translate that as, like let us, or let them, something like that. First and that's the plurals. And an example, well, I should say, it can be negated. You guessed it, with nay. Okay. And an example of this is, let's go back to Genesis. Dixit quae Deus. And God said, fiat lux. Let there be light. Okay. This has nothing to do with it, but et facta est lux. And the light, and there was light, or the light happened. Okay. But that fiat lux, let there be light. It's a command for the light, but not addressing the light directly in the second person. So that's the jussive, and that's all we've got for these chapters. That's all we're going to cover. I know that's a lot, but this is something that you'll practice now in your exercises. So remember to, if you haven't already, do the reading in Wheelock, do the reading in the Smith book. Do the exercises, and we'll talk about them in class. And then, you can ask questions and all that, and we'll really dig into it more with actual examples from your exercises. So that's all I got for you today. I'll see you soon, and have a good day.